Okay, can you see my modules section here?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
what I wanted to do today was kind of just run through the first 4 of these. Now, internally, there are a few videos that would run for 10 minutes or so, so we won't watch them straight through, but I'll kind of highlight why they're worth watching as we go along. And we want to kind of end up at the end of the perceptron session with a sense of what a perceptron is, and then I'll sort of highlight what we'll do in the session tomorrow in terms of trying to kind of build one among ourselves. Okay, so I'm going to jump to the overview first, and I'm going to run through these as if I were you looking at them, but I won't try to write the answers out and things. So basically, when we start with computer vision or how do machines see, we want to kind of pose the problem for ourselves in the following way. In the last module, when we looked at patterns, we came up with a method for describing textual patterns, right? So we said that a zip code will look like something that has 5 digits, and a digit is something that is between 0 and 9 in the ASCII code system, and so on. So what we were doing there is we were writing out, we're kind of hard coding pattern recognizers. What we want to do with computer vision is ask whether we could take that to another level, and that other level is going to be, could we build a machine that we could show something to and have the machine be able to pick up the fact that there is a pattern in it, and then can we interact with the machine to say, essentially, so machine, look at this pattern, and I'm going to tell you that that is, say, a letter T. And then I'm going to show you another letter T, written slightly differently, a different font or a different handwriting. And I'm going to say that one, that's also a letter T. And then I'll show it in A, and I'll say that's not a T. And what I want to know is, can I build a machine that would automatically figure out what T's look like based on my having told it that a bunch of things are T's and a bunch of other things are not T's, right? So the difference between this and the pattern recognition, in the pattern recognition, there was a certain amount of what a philosopher would call a priori information. A priori meaning it was there at the start. So we already had the definition of the ASCII coding system and letters of the alphabet and things like that. And so we were trying to describe patterns with a lot of the material already there. What we want to do this time is say, can I teach the machine to recognize a pattern without, in a sense, talking about the pattern? Right? So a regular expression, in a sense, is a conversation where we're kind of describing the pattern. What I want to do here is say, I don't actually know what the pattern is, but I'm going to show you some examples of things that fit the pattern. And what I want the machine to do is figure out what the pattern is. So the way that we're going to build this machine, or learn or think through building the machine, is we're going to start out by learning something about the way biological vision works. And the main things we want to take away from that are 3 things. One is that our eyes evolved to be able to detect points of light. So we have cells in our eyes and a lens and so on. And one of the things that they do is they pick out individual points of light. The second thing is that our brains take that information and they can put the points together to see patterns or to see objects. So you can see 2 points next to each other and say those are a part of the same thing. And then the third step is we take those objects and we relate them to our knowledge about the world. So we'll start out by just learning a little bit about the anatomy of vision. Then the second thing we'll do is talk about how neurons work. So we'll look at biological neurons and just do a little quick high school biology revisiting. And the main thing we want to do there is recognize that a neuron is a thing that has a whole bunch of tendrils that go out and pay attention to the environment. And the environment that they're paying attention to is other neurons. And the basic way a neuron works is if a certain fraction of the things that it's paying attention to fire an electric signal, then that neuron will decide to fire an electric signal. Then what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, so we know something about the way neurons work. Could we construct a simple mathematical model of those? Can we construct an artificial neuron, a mathematical neuron, that captures the essential qualities of real neurons? And what we'll end up having there is a device that has one or more inputs and a central function that takes a weighted sum of those inputs. So a weighted sum is what you're familiar with when you ask the professor in a class, how much is the first exam worth? How much are the problem sets worth? How much is class participation worth? Because what you know is you're going to get a grade on each of those things, but they're going to be weighed differently in the final grade for the course. So the neuron is going to be something that takes a bunch of inputs and then constructs a weighted average or a weighted sum of those inputs, and then it decides whether it's going to activate or not, whether it's going to fire or not. Lastly, we'll take those and we'll say, what happens if we put them together in a network? Can I start to see how I could build this pattern recognizing system by taking and connecting these neurons together? Okay, so stare at this picture. Maybe blow it up larger. Has anybody yawned yet?
I was fighting the urge.
So what are we seeing here in this picture? Have you ever been around people who are yawning? It starts to make us yawn ourselves, right? So that is actually a great model for the way neurons work. So there's this social behavior where if I see a certain number of people yawning around me, there's a high likelihood that I'm going to feel like yawning. But in fact, it can even happen by talking about it, right? We can talk about yawning enough and we'll have to yawn because it'll just be infectious. So neurons work, as I said, in a similar manner. And so the graphic on the top of this page is a network of neurons. So each of the gray circles is a neuron. And when they turn red, that means that the neuron is firing. And the pattern that we see is we start off with two neurons firing, and then a neuron that's listening to the two of them fires, and then another one fires, and then the neurons listening to them fire, and so on. So neurons passing a signal along is a bit like a group of people yawning, and then some people see them yawn, and they start to yawn, and then some people see them yawn, and so on. This video down the bottom is another example of this kind of phenomenon.
Purpose.
Yep, ready? Okay, this is 7 by 7 mouse traps service.
All right, we're not putting up any.
So it turns out that the math, the underlying phenomena here is something that we see in neurons. We see it in crowds. It's the same math that we see in nuclear fission when a pile of uranium goes critical. And most recently, these models have been used to talk about the spread of the COVID virus. So a similar sort of thing happens. So the math that's behind what we're doing now turns out to be very useful in lots of contexts. So quick challenge, just think to yourself, how would you define the verb to see? So in a classroom, we'd be writing this down and then we'd ask people to read it, but we'll just jump on to the thing here. So a lot of times we come up with things like we can see, meaning that we receive light stimuli from the outside world, and then our brains process that into colors and shapes and sizes and so on. But of course, the problem with this is there's a sense in which we're talking about seeing using seeing. So we might want to see if we can't define it. We might want to see if we can't define seeing in a manner that doesn't depend on using the idea of seeing in the definition. Before we move on to the next one, just there's a chapter in this book called Machine Learning for Humans that kind of gives an overview of all the stuff we'll do in the last 2 modules. At the bottom of the blue slide here, we have the sort of 3 things that are going to be important for us going forward. Number 1 is we have to see means to respond to visual, to light, the stimulation of light. It involves the processing of information after that perception, after the responding to it. And then thirdly, that we have to process, our brains have to cognitively take that information, which is just, was there a light at this location or not? And we have to process it into some sense of a representation of the world outside of us. So on your own, want to watch this video. You'll see it's a short TED Talk.
The human eye is an amazing mechanism, able.
So in about 4 minutes, they walk you through the evolution of eyes from primitive organisms up to our own. Useful background to have going forward. And then this is a slightly longer, it's about a 10-minute lecture by a medical school professor about the neural anatomy of vision. So it's about how the brain works. And a small warning about this video. The presenter actually dissects a real brain toward the end of the video. So you may or may not want to be watching this right after you've eaten or what have you. But it's a pretty cool video. Okay, so so that's part 1. And like I say, the takeaway is to realize that what the eye does is essentially take in pixel information about the world, and then the brain takes that information and does some processing of it to identify things like lines and circles and areas and so on. Okay, so session number 2 is about neurons. And we'll start out with this Khan Academy video about the anatomy of a neuron. It's delightfully short, very well done. Here's some pictures of biological neurons. And you see they have these 2 ends, one end that is sort of sensing the world, and then the other end that's sending out signals. And this is the nucleus, or the center of it, where all the action happens. So this is a picture of a neuron and then 3 neurons together. So the inputs are up at this dendrite end. And then the long thing that comes out is called the axon. Right, so the signals are coming in the part that looks kind of wiry here on the left. And then when the neuron fires, it sends an electrical signal down the axon, and that can be detected by the dendrites of another neuron that happen to be listening to it, that are connected to it. So here we have the red, the blue, and the green neurons, and they're firing, and that sends a signal And then the yellow neuron hears that signal, processes it, and says, is that enough? Is that just 3 things going off meet my threshold? And if so, then I will fire. Right? So this is like each of us, we're surrounded, 3 people around us yawn, and that's not enough to make us yawn. But 4 people around us yawn, and now we're going to yawn. So here's something which, at this point, we can kind of treat this as like a food for thought. So if a neuron pays attention to some set of other neurons, and each of those other neurons either fires, either sends an electrical signal or does not send an electrical signal, then we can think of the input to a neuron as being a series of zeros and ones. So it gets a 0 from any neuron that doesn't fire, and it gets a 1 from a neuron that does fire. Now, if we put those neurons that I pay attention to in some order, right? So just put them in order left to right or what have you. Then I can think of the fact of whether a given neuron fired or not as 1 bit in a long binary number. And then what I do as a neuron is I listen to that pattern and I decide whether to fire or not. And so I'm like a mathematical function which maps from this long string of zeros and ones to either 0 or 1. So the reason we bring this up now is only because later on when we talk about machine learning and artificial intelligence, you'll hear people say that training a network is really just learning a function. And what we mean by that is what we're seeing here, is that when you take a network and we train it, we're basically teaching the neurons in it how to get a particular functional relationship correct. So typically the ultimate output of a whole network of neurons is going to be yes or no, something is or is not a cat, or yes or no, this X-ray shows disease or doesn't show disease. So we just sort of mentioned this as a way of sort of planting that seed to think of it, that what neurons do, what networks of neurons are doing is they're calculating, right, or they're simulating the calculation of a function.
I have a quick question.
Go for it.
So is the idea here that like it would figure out if there are more ones than zeros, and then
it could be more. A particular neuron might have a rule that says I only fire when 90% of my inputs are yes, are firing. Or I might be very sensitive, and I might say I fire when almost nothing is lit up. What we'll find out in practice is the way you design these things. A neuron will typically weigh its different inputs differently. There's a slide in my original lecture which shows how if you come home one day and you say to your family, I'm thinking of dropping out of college, and you have 2 brothers and they go, cool, man, that's really cool. And your mother says, well, if that's what you want, dear. And then your father says, over my dead body. It could be the case that even though 3 people said you should definitely do it, you might give more weight to your father's opinion, right? Or the other way around, right? Your parents might be against it. They might have all kinds of reasons you shouldn't drop out of college. But you actually weigh your brother's advice higher. And so the fact that one of your brothers says you should definitely do it, that counts for everything. So we do this all the time, right, where we get inputs from various places and we kind of weigh them in terms of how important or how dependable the advice is.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to take that neuron and create a mathematical model of it that looks like this. The inputs, x1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to xn, however many we want. So these are like the dendrites of the neuron. Okay, so they're going to be either an input from the world, or they'll be inputs from other neurons. And then the nucleus of the mathematical neuron is going to be something that sums up, and we use the Greek letter sigma here to signify that, is going to sum up the inputs, and then based on some criteria, decide whether to fire or not. So whether to output a 1 or output a 0. Oh, so here is my slide where I talk about how we do this in everyday life. The first part is that we're constantly looking at evidence and deciding, right? So an animal walks into my house. It's furry. It's got 4 legs. It's got a wet nose, and I sort of think, well, it looks like a dog, smells like a dog, but I don't know. Maybe it's a raccoon, right? And I'd keep looking for evidence to try, and little bits would come in, and you can think of those as little neurons that are firing. And at some point, I'm tipped over to say, indeed, I think it's a dog, or no, it's definitely not a dog, right? So that's a neural network, in a sense, doing that. And then lots of other examples on the list here. So you could think of each of the bits of input that I get is just an x1, x2, x3, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to weigh each input. I'm going to give a weight to it, right? And again, this is the image of if I'm asking for advice and my mom says one thing, my dad says one thing, and some guy out on the street says something, I'm probably going to weigh the advice from mom and dad more heavily than I would weigh the advice from some random guy on the street. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a weighted sum of those inputs. So I'm going to take the input x1 and I'm going to multiply it by the weight. And the weights are almost always going to be between 0 and 1. Right? Sometimes we'll go -1 to +1, so you could actually take off, but we'll think of it just as 0 to 1. So the inputs, remember, are going to be a 1 or a 0. Either that input fired or it didn't fire, and then I'm going to weigh that. So I then take and I sum them all up, and I figure out whether or not I should fire. Right? And that's pretty much all a neuron does. Right? So the example at the bottom here, suppose my threshold is 0.74, and the weighted sum of the inputs is 0.5, then I don't fire. If it's 0.6, I don't fire. 0.7, I don't fire. 0.71, don't fire. 0.72, I don't fire. 0.73, I don't fire. 0.74, finally, that's enough, and I fire. I send off a 1. What about 0.75? Do I fire more? Nope, just a 1. 0.8? Nope, just a 1. So think about a graph of what we just did. Imagine the bottom axis of a graph is the weighted sum of my inputs. So I could have as low as 0 or as high as, say, up to 1. Well, the output is either a 0 or a 1. So what's that graph going to look like? So think about it. I'm starting at when x is 0, I don't fire. When x is 0.1, I don't fire. X is 0.2, I don't fire. X is 0.3, I don't fire. X is 0.4, I don't. And I finally get up to x is 0.74, and boom, I fire. And then anything after that, I stay here. And so what we're going to see is it's called a step function. So the x-axis, the bottom axis, is the sum of the weighted inputs. And what this says is below a certain threshold, which we're going to call t, the output is 0. And as soon as you hit t, the output becomes 1, and it stays 1 after that. So what the nucleus of a neuron does is essentially implement a step function. Right? So the function says, I'm going to listen, nothing, 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 whoa, now I fire. And so that's just implementing that step function. So now this is the final picture of our mathematical model. We have an array of inputs, x1 through xn. We have an array of weights. Each input has a weight associated with it. We get the weighted sum of that, and then we put that through a step function, and that causes our neuron to either emit a 0 or emit a 1. So questions on that? Let that sink in a bit. So if you're tuned in, you might try this. So what I've got over here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 inputs. Then I've got 5 weights. And I'm using a negative weight here. So I want to compute the weighted sum here. Anybody got pencil and paper there? I can try to type it out here, see if I can do the math by inspection. 0.31 plus 0.33. Now, notice that there's a 0 in the third input, therefore I just skip it because it's the weight times the input. So the 0 inputs cause nothing to be contributed. And that's going to be minus 0.2, is 1 times minus 0.2, and then plus 0.17. And so the first two together make 0.64, and then minus 0.2 turns into 0.44, and then plus 0.17 is going to be 0.51, 0.61. Right, so the total is 0.61. So that's more than the threshold here. So what's my output?
1.
All right. So does that process make sense? Right, we're just taking the input numbers in each one times its weight. We add those together, compare that to the threshold, and then we output a 1 or a 0.
Seems fairly easy.
Back in the 1950s, when they were developing, after the Second World War, in the beginning of the Cold War, there was a real explosion in the idea that you could apply mathematics to public policy questions and governance and things like that. That we were gonna have a rational way of solving social problems, and so there got to be a real interest in applying ideas from control theory, which we saw a little bit of when we looked at automation, to various real-world problems. And as we said way back in the beginning of that automation module, cybernetics, as the word cybernetic, is related to the Greek word which gave us the word governor. And so cybernetics is the study of control, but there's an old historical linguistic relationship between the idea of control and governance. And so when we're thinking about artificial intelligence, one of the things that it's kind of useful to remember is that its roots are in the same place that the roots of automation were in. That we're trying to figure out how do you create a system which can kind of seek out the correct answer. And in the case of automation, like when we're trying to fly our drone, the correct answer was to search for a set of coefficients, a pk, a k sub p, a k sub I, and a k sub d, that would cause the drone to fly in a nice, even manner. And if we're trying to land a airplane on an aircraft carrier, or if I'm trying to pilot a canoe, it's the same kind of thing where I'm searching in a solution space, trying to find a set of numbers which is going to be the one that's going to get me to the place I want to get to most effectively. So it turns out that building a neural network is almost exactly the same kind of problem. So when we were trying to fly the drone, we were trying to find a combination of 3 numbers that would give us the steadiest flight, right? 3 numbers plus the target number, plus the target altitude number. When we're working with a neural network, it's a similar process. We're going to have a set of numbers. We're going to run the machine, and then we're going to see whether the machine gets it right or not. And we're going to use a measure of the error as feedback to go in and change those numbers. So in the same way that with the controller, we were building a feedback loop in, and the feedback loop, we conditioned it by paying attention to the integral, the derivative, proportion, and so on. But the idea was, as the thing is moving, it says, I know I want to be at 100 meters altitude. I'm not there yet. How should I adjust my numbers to get to the point where I'll have the right the right values for my coefficients? So with a neural network, we're doing exactly the same thing, except this time, instead of just 3 coefficients, the Kp, Kd, Ki, what we have is a whole bunch of weights on the connections between the inputs and the neuron itself. So this diagram shows that sort of logic. We take the inputs over on the left. They go through and are weighted, and then we compute the weighted sum. We put that through a step function, and then the system is going to say either the answer is this or the answer is that. And we're going to then say, well, that was great. You got it right this time. So that feedback is going to go in, and we're going to say that they got a correct answer. And the weights are going to get adjusted so that it kind of reinforces the fact that it was making a right decision. Now, on the other hand, if the output is incorrect, then we're going to slap the hand of the neural network, and we're going to say, I'm sorry, neural network, you didn't get that one right. And the feedback is going to go through, and then we're going to do something to the weights that will adjust them so that it's more likely you'll get it right next time. So here's the thing I want you to think about. Can you think of how you might describe this adjustment process, like what you would like to do in response to the error? Just if looking at just this picture.
I guess you would like adjust the weight for the correct or the or decrease the weight for the erroneous kind of values.
Okay, so let's push that a little bit. So you say the first part, which weights would you increase?
Things that were correct.
Okay, and then you would decrease the ones that were incorrect.
Yeah.
So let's imagine that the right answer is 1. Right, that we should have said 1. That's what the output from the step function should be, a 1. And remember, our inputs x1 through xn are either 1 or 0. It was supposed to be a 1, but we said 0. We were wrong. Now let's go back, and I'm going to ask you, which w's should I increase? And just go with your gut.
Yeah, the ones that like that come up with the 1.
Yes, right. So the anybody who had a 1 input, you might sort of say, I'm gonna increase those guys. And anybody who said 0, well, I can't do anything with those weights because they don't contribute, right? So there's nothing I can take away there. And then if the opposite happened, right? If I said 1 when I should have said 0, then I can go back and say, okay, how many people had a 1 as an input? I'm going to dig a little bit, and I'm going to reduce it down. So it's a bit like if you got advice from somebody, right? So you asked around, and people said, so I heard, you met this interesting person last week. Should you call them back? And one of your friends says, yeah, I think you should, based on what you said. Another one says, no, I think you shouldn't. And so you get all this input, and you decide, well, I'll give it a try. I'll give this person a call back. And you call the person back, and they turn out to be a real ass. And it's like, oh, that was a stupid idea. So now you kind of think, okay, which of my friends, based on the description I gave them, told me that I should call the person back? And you basically say, I'm going to just reduce the weight that I give to the opinions of those people because they just gave me bad advice. So that next time when I'm aggregating the advice that I get, I'm going to be more likely to get to a correct answer. So that process of looking at the error and then going back and adjusting the weights is what we call training in a neural network. And what we're trying to do is to come up with a set of weights that is going to make it so that this little network gets the answer correct for any set of inputs that it could get. Right, so the x1 through xn are any number of inputs, and we want to say, look, we're going to show you a bunch of inputs as a kind of training set, and we know what the answer is on each of them. And so we're going to show you the input, and then we're going to see what you say as a network, and then based on the error, we're going to then adjust some weights. And then we'll show you another input, and we'll see whether you get it right or wrong. And if you get it wrong, we will adjust the inputs. If you get it right, we'll adjust the inputs. And we do that, say, 1,000 times. And at the end of that process, we now have adjusted the weights in response to this training data. Then what we're going to like to do is say, what if we show the network something that wasn't in our training data? And at that point, we sort of say, if the network is well trained, then it's going to get that answer correct. This session ends with a video from Daniel Schiff, who's the guy who does this coding train. He introduces a thing called the perceptron, which is what we've just been describing. And he shows how to program one in Java. I would recommend a watch of it. It's optional. It kind of jumps in some ways farther ahead in the mathematics than we will do in this course. But it's nice because it's like watching a preview of a movie, right? You get to see where things are headed. So I finish with that in the sense that if you want to kind of dive in there and watch that, that's great. Recommended that you keep read forward in the AI Machine Learning for Humans book that we started with, and then just a little preview of what comes next. Oh, are you seeing a Excel spreadsheet now? So this will just give I'm just using Excel here just because it's easy for me to project and to draw. It's like I'm using it like a whiteboard here. So imagine that I've got a 5x5 block like this, and I'm going to make them all about the same size so that they're square. And what I'd like to do is to treat this 5x5 square as the whole world, the whole universe. And I'm going to build a network over here. So I'm going to sort of say I'm going to have a neuron here. So let's imagine that that's a neuron, and that's a neuron, and that's a neuron. And I'm going to, let's say I had that on the image. So I have what we might call the letter T on this. But really what this is you can think of this as square 0, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and so on, right? And so what you could say is, well, okay, this data here, so input 0 is a 1, input 1 is a 1, input 2 is a 1, input 3 is a 1, input 4 is a 1, input 5 is 0, input 6 is 0, input 7 is a 1, input 8 is 0, input 9 is 0. Let me see where that's how I'm doing that. Okay. So a data set like this could easily be represented as, oops, got to go back to Excel, not the projected version. So I could easily see it as just an array of 25 elements like that. And then what I could do is I could say, okay, this is one neuron. I'm going to call that neuron 1. And this is neuron 2. And this is neuron 3. And I'm going to say, what's inputs does neuron 1 pay attention to? And let's suppose it pays attention to 0, 2, 4, 6, and 8. And neuron 2 pays attention to 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. And then neuron 3 pays attention to neurons 10, 11, and all the rest up to. So can you see that what we've got here is it's just numbers written down on a piece of paper, but essentially it's the same model that we just had for that neuron. All I need to add, so if these are inputs, all I need to do is add weights. And then I'm going to just call all the weights initially 0.5. Okay, so we're going to finish with the question of, if I'm not going to put ones in here because these are all 1. I'll put 0 in here. So let's just calculate what the sum of the weighted inputs is going to be for this neuron number 1. So it pays attention to square 0, which is this one. And so I'm going to write the value up here. So that's a 1. It pays attention to number 2, which is this one. So that's a 1. It pays attention to number 4, which is this one. So that's a 1. It pays attention to number 6, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's a 0. And it pays attention to number 8, 7, 8, which is a 0. So the weighted sum is going to be 1 times 0.5, 1 times 0.5, 1 times 0.5. So the sum is going to be 1.5. And then if the threshold is set at, say, 1.3, then it fires. If the threshold is set at 1.7, then it doesn't fire. So that's just sort of a harbinger of what we'll do tomorrow, is basically setting up a network in this kind of thing, where the network is a set of neurons here, each of which is going to look at some random collection of the data here. Does my mouse pointer show up when I do that?
I don't see it.
Okay. Let's see if I do that, it does, right? Yeah. Look at that. So I'm going to start with, I've got a neuron like here, here, and here. And each of these neurons looks at some random collection of these input pixels. And then I compute this weighted sum. And then my network job is going to be then to feed the outputs of these three things to one more neuron, which I'm going to sit over here. And this is going to be the output neuron. And what it's going to do is it's going to be looking at N1, N2, N3, and it's going to have to make a decision based on what those three say. And if I show over here the letter T, and suppose that's what I'm trying to train it on, I'm going to say that's a letter T. I'm going to ask the network, do you produce a 1 or do you produce a 0? And if it produces a 1, I'm going to reward it and tell it that's great. And I'm going to strengthen the weights of the things that were 1s. If I say, is it a T, and it says yes, but it was wrong, then I'm going to weaken them. So that'll be the way we do the training. So anyway, that's what we'll do in the next show. Questions before we run? See you then. Bye-bye.
Yeah.